Richard Thaler is the Charles R. Walgreen Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And perhaps more impressively, the 2017 recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his contribution to behavioral economics. His research covers behavioral economics and finance, as well as the psychology of decision-making, which lies in the gap between economics and psychology. Professor Thaler is the author or co-author of an impressive number of books and journal articles, including the global bestseller Nudge, in which the concepts of behavioral economics are used to tackle many of society's major problems. He is the director of the Center for Decision Research and is the co-director with Robert Schiller of the Behavioral Economics Project in the National Bureau of Economic Research. Furthermore, he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Finance Association and the Econometric Society, and in 2015 served as the president of the American Economic Association. Before joining the University of Chicago faculty in 1995, Professor Thaler taught at the University of Rochester and Cornell, as well as visiting stints at the University of British Columbia, the Sloan School of Management at MIT, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Please join me in welcoming him to our Investment Symposium this year. So what we'd like to do is have a conversation here about behavioral economics and how it finds its way into a lot of decision-making processes. And I want to make at least some connection to why you're here and to our clients and investments. But we're going to touch on some of the other themes that we discussed earlier today as well. But just as a matter of getting the conversation started and kicking it off, I think all of us have an idea of what behavioral economics entails and what that research covers. But I think it would really be intuitive to have Professor Thaler kind of just discuss how do you define behavioral economics?
There's a guy called Herb Simon who was maybe an early practitioner of behavioral economics. And he has a definition where he points out that the term behavioral economics seems to be, and then he uses a fancy word, a neoplasm, which means redundant phrase. Pleonasm, I got it wrong. Anyway, why is it a redundant phrase? Well, he says, why do you need the adjective behavioral? What other kind of economics could there be? And presumably, economics is about the behavior of the people in the economy. Firms are made up of people, consumers, suppliers, right? It's all people. And then he answers the question, the reason we need that adjective lies in the assumptions of economics. Now, I'm sure you've all had an economics class sometime in your distant past. And if so, you remember that the people, well, they're not quite people, I call them econs. The agents in economic models don't resemble the people that you meet. They're really smart. They're as smart as the smartest economist, or possibly even as smart as the smartest economist thinks he is. Yes, I do have somebody in mind. And they have no self-control problems. So they pick the best thing at every opportunity. So they never drink too much or eat too much or exercise too little. They save for retirement without any help. So you can see, I don't know about the people you hang out with, but the people I hang out with aren't like that. And back when I was in graduate school, and I was trying to learn all these equations and get the basics of economic theory, I kept looking out the window and saying, there's a disconnect here. I remember wandering into the department chair's office and saying, this doesn't make any sense. go back to work. So I started collecting stories of behavior that is inconsistent with economic theory. I'll give you an example. When I was in grad school, I invited a bunch of my fellow econ grad students over for dinner. There was something cooking in the oven, lots of good smells, and we were having a round of adult beverages, waiting for dinner to be finished, and I brought out a bowl of cashew nuts that we started to nibble on. And you know how it is with salted nuts. You can't eat one. So after about 5 minutes, about half of this big bowl of cashew nuts was gone, and I realized that our appetites were in danger, not to mention our waistlines. So I grabbed the bowl of cashews and basically rudely took them off the table and hid them in the kitchen, and came back, and then there was a discussion, and there's a lesson here, which is you don't want to have too many economists at a dinner party. But we started analyzing what had just happened. And the first thing was people realized they were happy. Everybody said, oh, thank God you got those nuts out of here. And then the second comment was, wait a minute, we're not allowed to be happy. Because first principle of economics is more choices are always better than fewer choices. So before we had the choice, eat nuts or not eat nuts. Like right now, you have a choice, eat cookies or not eat cookies, unless you've already finished the cookies. So after I took away the nuts, we didn't have that choice. So we must be worse off, but we're happy. How can that be? So I started a list of things like that I put on my blackboard in my office and tried to make sense of them. And I've basically spent 40 years making lists of weird behavior and trying to understand them.
Behavioral economics has certainly become more mainstream over the years, though. I think a lot of us today, I can speak from a consultant's perspective, try to account for that in some way or another. We certainly don't do it perfectly, but it has become more of an accepted way of thinking and trying to account for that. And as you've assembled your research and worked on your research over the years and written journals and written books, what have been kind of the pushbacks on that? Or was there a tipping point where no one wanted to listen to behavioral economics, no one wanted to really account for it, and then suddenly the gates opened, and then, oh, we do have account. Was there kind of a eureka moment, or has it kind of been a steady build to get where it is today?
So there is certainly no eureka moment. I mean, there have been plenty of eureka moments for me, but it's not like all of a sudden one day economists started accepting this. And my more recent book, which is called Misbehaving, sort of tells the story of how the field was created. And I have a chapter where I talk about all the complaints that we used to have to go through. And it's like every time I would write a paper or I would go to give a talk at some conference or at a university workshop, there was a sort of a list of questions that I knew I was going to get. And a friend of mine, well, he's not young anymore, but he's younger, young behavioral economist at Harvard, calls these explainations. And these were like, yeah, but. One is we would run experiments to try to demonstrate some phenomenon. And then people would say, yeah, but the stakes are low. And so if you raised the stakes, then people would get it right. Now, if you think about it, you can see why an economist might think that. But if you think a little further, you realize it's a preposterous claim. So let's go back 10 years to the financial crisis. What caused that? Lots of people making lots of mistakes on very high stakes. People taking out mortgages that they shouldn't have. That's the biggest financial decision most people make, buying a house and then leveraging it. The people who lend them the money. The people who raided the securities. At every level of that, there were people making very high stakes mistakes. And there is just simply no evidence that we get better as the stakes go up. And in fact, we can all think of counterexamples to that. I know there are some golfers in the room. Imagine trying to make a 10-foot putt for $1 million. I wouldn't be able to hold the club. The chance that the ball got anywhere near the hole would be tiny. So the idea that if we just pay people more, then they're going to behave better, there's simply no empirical evidence for that. The other complaint I used to get in this book, Misbehaving, I call this the invisible hand wave. And I attribute it to Milton Friedman, the late Lord High Priest at the University of Chicago in the 50s and 60s. And the invisible hand wave, well, it's a very rude term. And obviously it plays on Adam Smith's famous invisible hand, but the hand wave refers to the following argument. Yeah, people do stuff, these funny things that you point out, but in markets, like in, say, securities markets or housing markets, then, and now comes the hand wave part, because I claim that it's impossible to finish that sentence keeping your hand still. In fact, no one has ever done it. Try it. So, yeah, they're doing something, but in markets, then what? So, suppose that you have taken the wrong career. You shouldn't be an economist or an analyst. You should, you should have been a professional golfer.
It's far-fetched if you've seen my golf game.
Yeah,
but,
right. What's the market going to do? Nothing, right? You're doing okay. In fact, it must be the case that all of us are doing not exactly the thing we should be doing. It would be sheer luck and happenstance if we happen to land in exactly the right thing. I'm probably as close to that as possible because I'm not really suited to anything else. But so I mean, it is true that if I tried to become a professional golfer, I wouldn't make any money. I'd probably move on to something else. But, if you buy the wrong house or the wrong car or take out the wrong mortgage, you just end up a little poorer or a little less happy. You don't die. You don't disappear. All the people that made mistakes in the period that led up to the financial crisis, there are very few fatalities. Sure, some people lost their homes, but they don't go away. So there's almost like a religious belief in some places, and this belief was found more heavily on the south side of Chicago than anywhere else, which is, of course, why I thought it was a great idea for me to take a job there, because, hang out with your enemies, and you're going to learn. Now, I'm a frequent golf partner with Gene Fama, so I know all of his lines, and I know his golf game, and I know how he thinks, and one of the things I learned early on was when you're writing papers that go against the conventional wisdom, you have to be able to anticipate what the reaction is going to be. And so early on, I would adopt a strategy of when I would write a paper, I would think of the 2 or 3 economists that would hate this paper the most. And then I would write it for them. So to do that, you have to learn how they think. So they're going to say, oh yeah, but this. So in the paper, now you might be thinking, and then you refute it. And it doesn't mean they accept it immediately, but at least the first 3 of their arguments you've undercut. So it didn't happen overnight. It feels like an overnight sensation, but I've been doing this for 40 years, and it doesn't feel overnight to me.
I'd like to link some of your studies in behavioral economics to why most of us are here, working on committees and investments and trying to achieve a goal. And I think one of the battles that we all face is market volatility and decisions going against you. And particularly overreacting. I know you've done a lot of work about prices and price. Stocks that go down tend to rebound, and their subsequent return is stronger than stocks that have been strong already. So can you share a little bit of your research and thoughts on that? I think, anecdotally, our belief is that you never want to sell at the bottom, right? You want to buy low, sell high. But that's a tough battle to fight a lot of the time because of momentum and just because of really behavioral economics. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that and advice around that topic.
I didn't start out in finance, so the first finance paper I wrote because I had a grad student who wanted to do finance. So I said, okay, sure, that'll be fun. And the paper we wrote, which was called "Does the Stock Market Overreact?" was extremely simple. We went back to 1926, which is when the data start, and we formed portfolios of the biggest winners and losers over various formation periods, 3 to 5 years. And then we would track them over the next, so let's say 5-year formation period and then 5-year test period. And as you suggested, what we found was the biggest losers over the next 5 years outperformed the market by about 30%. The biggest winners underperformed the market by about 10%. So now, this in and of itself is not a viable investment strategy. first of all, those companies, like the losers, the ones you want to buy, have gotten pretty small, right? If you're among the 50 biggest losers over the last 5 years, you're a lot smaller than you used to be, and the liquidity isn't there. So you couldn't really run this literally, but there are variations on it that you can, and it's very much related to value strategies. Mm-hmm. And the thing about value strategies is, let me tell you a funny story about when we were doing that research. It was the student's name, some of you may know because he teaches it now at DePaul, Werner de Bond. And when we got this result, there were a group of us, we were all poor, and we thought, we'll invest in this. And we got him to run, all right, what 35 stocks do we want to buy? We got the list, and I said, at this point, there's no Bloomberg terminals. There were like books in the library. And I warned my fellow investors, don't go look these companies up, because once you do, you'll never want to do this. So of course people went and looked them up, and one company, the CEO's in jail, and you can imagine what those companies look like. So all like die-hard value investors say they buy the stocks that everybody else hates. But you're right that the psychology of buying a stock because it's gone down a lot, it's hard. Now, the same is true for hiring portfolio managers. So, let's get to exactly what this meeting is all about. Somebody, I think you referred to the line that every single person in this room can recite from memory, which is, past returns are no guarantee of future returns. Now, I'm involved with a money management firm out in California that invests in mostly small cap US equities. So I've been in some finals presentations. And every single person in that room can recite that mantra. And yet, it's guaranteed that the 4 or 5 managers that were invited to the meeting all have high returns. Mm-hmm. Well, what's going on here? Now, let me tell you an interesting fact. There was a study done that looked at the performance of portfolio managers that got fired compared to the managers that replaced them. And you can probably guess where this is going. Mm-hmm. The ones that got fired outperformed the ones that got hired. This is also true in sports. The team does lousy, what do? You fire the coach or the general manager or both. You never fire the owner. There was a study done in the British Premier League, the top soccer league in the world, that looked at teams that fired the coach, or they would call them the guy, the manager, and compared them with other teams that had the same record going back. It's very much like the DeMont and Thaler. So you go back, you take a team that's only won a quarter of its games for the last 20 games, and then you match one team that fired the coach and the other that didn't. Now, what happens? Well, the ones that fire the coach get better, but not as much as the ones that don't fire the coach. Now, my friend Danny Kahneman refers to this as the fallacy of intervention. Because when things are going badly, you think you should do something. And then things tend to get better. Well, what do we call that? Regression toward the mean, right? If you go out and play the worst round of golf in 3 years, chances are your next round will be better. And vice versa. If you have the round of your life, you're convinced that you've figured it out. And the next one will be worse. So, but notice the deep lesson here, which is that making a change feels good, but doesn't necessarily lead to a happy outcome. And I know the last thing we want to do is get into a discussion of politics, but I will say that we've seen around the world a lot of people voting kind of the way of firing the coach, that they're unhappy with something and they want to say, I want to change. And that has to do with the Trump election and the Brexit vote. I spend a lot of time in London, and it's very similar kinds of feelings. And it's none of those, well, not none, but 90-some% of those voters are not running a spreadsheet, right? You go talk to some voter in some rural part of the UK and say, why did you vote to leave? And they'll start saying how, you know, times are bad and grumbling about things. And if you start to press them, well, okay, how is leaving the EU going to make it better for you? They don't have anything resembling a coherent answer. But they're angry and they want to change. And so when you're ready to fire that portfolio manager, take a deep breath and ask yourself whether that's because the portfolio manager, what they're doing no longer works, or whether it's a bad streak and that will turn around. There's no way to know, but if we believe past returns don't predict future returns, then we have to go on other things as well.
I'm going to go a little off script here.
I didn't know we were on a script.
Well, I'm on a script. I'm curious to hear. Have you spoken with Gene Fama? Speaking of bad streaks, we had a whole talk earlier talking about value underperforming growth, and it's kind of been a 10-year period now where typically value has outperformed. And clearly, he's done a ton of research on that and written a lot of papers and started numerous investment strategies off of it. Have you discussed with him at all the value underperformance? Does he have any rationale or explanation for it, or just simply that this is, like you said, a bad streak and ultimately regression to the mean will at some point value will again outperform growth?
The secret to our friendship is that when we're on the golf course, we don't talk about finance.
Fair enough.
No finance, no religion, although there are jokes that go back and forth. But we both play down at Beverly. I think there's some Beverly members here, but and the members find us funny, the two old professors walking around. And to the outside world, we are like arch enemies. And we're actually pretty good friends. So the way Gene describes our intellectual views, which I agree with, is that we agree about all the facts and we disagree about the interpretations. So, for example, value, I attribute to what we would call mispricing. So I would say, like, the behavioral explanation for the value premium is that there are some stocks that are too cheap, that for whatever reason, the market doesn't fully appreciate what the company's doing. Maybe because for the ones that have had a long slide, part of it is like stereotyping, that a company gets a reputation as a bad company. If you're old enough, you can remember when Apple was a bad company. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in the late 90s, it looked like they were going to go belly up. And now they're worth $1 trillion. So you have to worry about these stereotypes. So that's the behavioral view, is mispricing, and there are lots of factors that can go into trying to determine why a stock is mispriced too high or too low. The Fama French story is, no, it's not mispricing, because Gene invented the efficient market hypothesis. It's risk. So the argument is that those value stocks are riskier. Now, there was a long academic debate about this issue. I can give you my version, which is no one has been able to identify a way in which value stocks are riskier. They don't have higher betas. They don't go down more when the market goes down. They don't go bankrupt more often. Well, they do go bankrupt more often, but if you buy a portfolio, all the academic studies take account of survivorship bias. So if they go bankrupt, fine, you have a portfolio. So they're not riskier in a way that we can identify. Gene will say, well, but they move together, and he has this value premium. Now, their model has evolved over time. It was 3 factors, then it's 5 factors. One of them now is profitability or quality. Various people have different names for it. There's no way you can think of that as a risk factor. Right? Apple may be risky in the sense that its price may be too high, but there's no risk that Apple is going to go out of business. Right? They've got a few $100 billion in cash. That ought to tide them over for a while. So now the question you asked is sort of the fluctuations in the value premium. I don't think Gene has an official view on that, and neither do I.
Okay.
So that's something we can agree about. And another thing we can agree about is that if value always outperformed, it would no longer be true.
Right.
Because everybody would buy it.
Right.
So whether it's risk or mispricing, it has to be that any strategy has to have good and bad periods, or it becomes an arbitrage opportunity and disappears. So we know that the price of gold in New York and London have to be the same within pennies, or you can make an infinite amount of money. Mm-hmm. So there are no free lunches. That part of Chicago gospel is true. And I have no prediction about whether value will be better or worse than usual going forward, or size. We at Fuller and Thaler, we invest in small cap because we're active and we think that we have a bigger edge there. And I think it's very hard for any active manager to think that they can beat the market, especially like in the top 50 stocks, because every investment manager in the world is studying those companies, and what edge do you think you have? Whereas down in the smaller world, instead of 50 analysts, there's one or two analysts, and prices can get more out of whack, we think.
So you spent a great deal of work, or a lot of your career, researching examples of when human behavior is inconsistent with rationalist economic theory. I'm wondering, are there any examples you find especially humorous or really made you scratch your head and think twice about what was going on?
Most of them, actually. Well, I'll tell you a story about my daughter, Maggie, who's an astute student of behavioral economics. And one of the things that I've talked about over the years, one of the things that was on my list was something I call the endowment effect, which is that there's a big difference between the price somebody's willing to pay for something and the price they would demand to give it up. So I'll give you a little thought experiment. It's only for the Cubs fans. Let's suppose that the Cubs make it to the World Series. And you are given 2 tickets. And they're good seats. How much would you demand to sell them? You know, you could sell them on StubHub. So it's a legal transaction. All right, so that's question 1. Question 2, you're a big Cubs fan, they're in the World Series. You can go to StubHub and buy them. How much are you willing to pay? Well, for most people, those numbers differ by at least a factor of 2. So somebody will say, I'd pay $1,000 for a ticket, but I'd demand $2,000 to give it up. Okay? So now here's the story. A few years ago, the Mets were in the playoffs, and my daughter Maggie, one of their pitchers, Matt Harvey, had lived across the street from them in Rhode Island. And he was pitching, and I thought, gee, it'd be really nice to buy Maggie and her husband tickets to that Mets playoff game that their friend was going to pitch in. But this was kind of a last-minute idea. So I go online. I had tried to work some angles. That didn't work. So I go online, and this was the first round of the playoffs. So ticket prices weren't crazy. And I found you could get decent tickets for, say, $400 each. So, but I couldn't I was traveling, I couldn't figure out a convenient way for me to buy them and get them to her. So I sent her a link to the website, StubHub or SeatGeek or whatever it was, and said, look, Mag, it looks like you can get 2 tickets for $700-800. Pick the ones you want. I'll send you $1,000. Go have fun. And I get a text back from her. Ha! This is just like from your book. If you give me $1,000, we're not going to use it to buy baseball tickets. So, yeah, it's all pretty funny, I think. Well, I'll tell you another story. My wife and I divide our time between Chicago and California, and we were switching locations in California. And we were negotiating on what was going to be our new house. And you know how these things go. After the inspection, some things come up, and the seller and I are negotiating over like tens of thousands of dollars. But we're both drawing lines in the sand. And eventually we reach a deal. And so we bought the house. And then the real estate agent sends me an email and says, you know, somebody had been interested in that house. And it never went on the market. So, and they were disappointed to have missed out. They're willing to offer you $200,000 more than you paid to sell them the house. Now, there's no way we would have been willing to pay $200,000 more for that house. But we thought about selling it to them for about 10 seconds and said, nah. So it even happens to me.
One of the things that is one of the underlying themes of our discussions today has been technology, and not only technology on equity market performance, but kind of accounting for technology being a more and more part of everyday life. And my question is, as technology improves and become more and more of everyday lives, and for a lot of people probably part of more of our decision-making process, is there a way to better account for these faults as discovered by behavioral economics with the use of technology? We spent some time internally talking about AI, right, and the idea of AI, and can AI eliminate or reduce some of the mistakes that have been discovered through behavioral economics?
Well, look, I think AI and computers in general can eliminate lots of mistakes. There was an incident last week on some airline. I don't know whether it was an Indian airline or maybe somebody read the story, but there was a switch that the crew forgot to turn on that didn't, the cabin pressure wasn't adjusted properly, and some people started having nosebleeds and so forth and so on. Now, years ago, this system of checklists was adopted by pilots, and it's a very good system. And we actually use it at our firm. For a given strategy, a portfolio manager will have a checklist of things they have to look at before they buy. But checklists are obsolete. And there's no way that plane should have been technically able to take off without that switch being on. And if you think about your car, it's got all kinds of features like that. So for example, with all the modern keys, it's not possible to lock the keys in the trunk. Thank God. Because I would have done it like 5 times. Or lock the keys in the car, which is really easy to do now, right? Because you don't have to put the key in the ignition. So it's very easy to put the keys in the console or something, and then you get out of the car. In fact, valets have to deal with this like 5 times a night, that people pull up and go into the restaurant and they have the keys. And but you can't lock your car with the keys in the car. Now, that's preventing a bias. We should want to design as much of our life as possible to make it idiot-proof. And I greatly appreciate it in my car. Cars have gotten safer. Many new cars now will alert you if you're getting too close to a nearby car, or if you're going outside your lane. This is all because we're human and we make mistakes, and technology can reduce the mistakes. Now, so absolutely yes. It doesn't have to be, artificial intelligence is sort of a big word. It can be just an electronic checklist. Good software has all of these things. Are you sure you want to erase all of your emails? Now, there should be more of those. I think all email systems ought to have an "Are you sure?" for any reply all that has more than, say, 5 people. How many people have seen a catastrophic reply all email, right? I mean, all of us, right? So but this can be done. Sometimes it can be done with machines. Sometimes it has to be done with humans. So, for example, let's suppose you go into a restaurant, and restaurants tend to be dark. I don't know why, but they tend to be dark. And, oftentimes there's somebody that's guiding you to your table, and they'll say, watch your step. And when they say that, it's because there's a small step that's easy to miss. Right? So that's a predictable error, and it's handled with a human who's warning you this is a place that people fall down, and they would rather have fewer lawsuits. So they warn you. So humans can do it, but if we can, look, it would be better to get rid of the step. And it would be better if it was done automatically. Elevators, won't chop your arm off, thank God, right? So, but we can't get machines to do everything, and then we have to still use our heads to say, what are the mistakes we're most likely to make, and how can we avoid them?
Well, and speaking of mistakes we're most likely to make, it kind of brings me to the last topic I want to ask you about, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience for Q&A. Mistakes people tend to make, not saving enough for retirement. And I know some of your books, Nudge in particular, touched upon this and touched upon features like auto-enrollment, auto-escalation, those types of features to encourage greater saving. But I think we can all agree that the United States as a whole is still very ill-prepared for retirement. So I'm curious to hear a little more about your research as relates to behavioral economics, and then perhaps some of the suggestions that have fallen out of that research for encouraging greater savings behavior for all of us for retirement.
Sure. So the design of defined contribution retirement plans is probably the domain where behavioral economics has had its biggest impact. So automatic enrollment, automatic escalation, a former student of mine and I invented that. We called it Save More Tomorrow, because we all have more self-control next week or next month when we plan to resume our diet and exercise regime. So our idea was invite people to increase their contribution rates next year when they get a raise, because if it's time to coincide with a raise, then they don't see their paycheck go down. More than half of large US companies employ both of these. The third pillar of the smart defined contribution plan is well-designed default investment vehicles. And I and many others fought a battle with the Labor Department to get these things created. There was a period, the old-timers will remember, when the only permissible default investment was a money market account or a GIC. So, target date funds and things like that are a big improvement for investors that have no idea what they're doing. So, but there are still mistakes people are making. Company stock, there's still plans with big chunks of company stock. If you're one of those, think again. We've had plenty of disasters like Enron, Bear Stearns. Now you'd think Bear Stearns is a pretty sophisticated place. Something like 90% of the 401k money was invested in their stock. Now, for the rich investment bankers, that's one thing. For the secretaries and clerical staff, not so good. So every person in this room believes in diversification. You shouldn't have a big chunk of your retirement money invested in the company you work for. I wouldn't want to have a big part of my wealth tied up in University of Chicago stock, right? I should be short Chicago, long Kellogg. Fortunately, they're not traded, so, But the other big mistake people are making is, even if they're doing automatic enrollment, most plans are starting way too low. And this is a ridiculous state of affairs. I can tell you, so how many people in the room have a plan with automatic enrollment? Okay, how many of you of those start at 3%? So here's how that happened. Back sometime during the Clinton administration, so I don't remember the exact date, automatic enrollment was new. We were trying to get companies to adopt it. Companies were saying, look, we're not sure it's legal. The lawyers. So the lawyers are worried that we're enrolling people without their explicit permission. So I called a friend who was working in the Treasury Department and said, is there anything you guys can do to help? And he was a fan of this idea, and he said, yeah, sure. And he got a advisory letter written saying it's okay to do this. Now, the way such letters are typically drafted is that you give an example. And the example was, suppose some company automatically enrolls people into a plan at a 3% saving rate. So all of a sudden, people start using a 3% initial rate. It's too low. So our research suggests that there's no reason not to start at 6. That the opt-out rate does not go up appreciably if you start at 6 rather than 3. And the rules to get a waiver from the non-discrimination rules, where you have to start at X and go up by, there's no reason. The automatic escalation also need not be 1%. That's another just a lazy habit. It could be 1.5%, right? It doesn't have to be a round percent. It could be 2%. And it doesn't have to stop at wherever it stops. So all these things need to be rethought. And matching formulas also could use a lot of thought. The evidence is that matching is not a very effective way of increasing saving rates compared to these design features.
Well, let me pause here and ask the audience for questions. Are there questions out there that you have about behavioral economics, something that's been touched upon today, or something you're just curious about? We got a couple over here. Do we have, if you just want to shout it out, we'll repeat it. Go ahead, sir, right here in front. Yep, go ahead.
Appreciate your comments, and you're obviously a good golfer. So I've been playing for 60 years, it doesn't get easier. Quick question, if you were going to have dinner with Elon Musk tonight, what would you talk about?
So, it's funny. You can find, if you look around the internet hard, you'll see that my friend Daniel Kahneman, who wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow and won the Nobel Prize in 2002, he and I and a young guy called Sendel, we taught a day-and-a-half long class about 10 years ago. And among the students was Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and several other tech types. So I've met him. And it's obvious that he has a volatility problem. I mean, it's also obvious that he's unbelievably brilliant and talented. I mean, getting that rocket to go up and then come back down on the same place, you know. So, you know, I think he needs some adult supervision. But on the other hand, I mean, if you think of what he's done, starting an automobile company from scratch and a space company that, the two, like, most unlikely things you would think you could start from scratch. So, yeah, so I am a fan of his. I wouldn't want to be married to him. Not that either of us are gay, but you know what I mean. I wouldn't want him to be my roommate because I think he'd be hard to live with. So he's got to figure that out, and like some other people we can think of, he probably would be best if he stayed off Twitter.
Other questions? I'll look for hands. Nat, go ahead.
So you obviously sort of trailblaze a lot in the behavioral finance field, but a lot of people come after you. Are there any particular findings that somebody who's come after you have discovered or highlighted that you sort of think were particularly noteworthy? You think, I wish I had thought of that?
Oh, well, I mean, there are many. Let me tell you one I came across yesterday. So there's one of my mentees, is that the right word? There's a guy at Berkeley called Terry O'Dean, has a paper that shows that portfolio managers that did well in a stock before are more likely to buy it again. And it's like you had a good experience with that stock, and maybe you have good memories of it. Now, look, this is a rational strategy for choosing restaurants, right? But if the fact that I had a good run with Amazon between 2000 and 2005 doesn't mean that it's an attractive buy for me now. So that one I thought is one I came across recently, and in fact, I emailed one of our portfolio managers and said, you ought to see, he's the guy who's been doing it longest at our firm, and I said, it'd be interesting to see whether you're guilty of this.
So we have time for one more question. Right up front here. Go ahead.
I love the title of the book, Nudge, and I love the idea behind it. And I wonder, in a world where intellectuals tend to always think the world should be run by intellectuals, business people tend to think the world should be run by business people, bureaucrats think the world should be run by bureaucrats. What are the dangers of that gentle nudge becoming the heavy push? And how do you guide against that? How would you as an economist think, how do we take the good principle of the nudge and keep it from becoming the authoritarian, paternalistic shove?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question. And let me elaborate on it as well. So anytime anybody asks me to sign a copy of that book, I always sign it Nudge for Good. And I mean that as a plea, not as necessarily an expectation. And that's true in the public sector and the private sector. So recently I've coined a new term that I call sludge. And of course, literally, sludge is the gunk that screws things up. Now, many nudges work through my mantra, make it easy. If you want people to do something, make it easy. That's the idea of automatic enrollment. If you don't want people to do something, make it hard. So I'll give you one example of sludge that I'm campaigning against. When the first review of Misbehaving came out a couple of years ago, my editor sent me a link to a review in the Times of London. And I click on the link, and there's a paywall. Now, I want to read this review. It's the first review of the book. And there it says, 1 month trial for £1. And I say, well, I'm happy to pay £1 to read the review of my book. But then, I wrote the book, so I start reading the fine print, and I see that of course, after a month, I will be automatically enrolled in a subscription for £27 a month. And to cancel, I have to give 14 days notice, and I have to call London, not on a toll-free line, in London business hours. So I knew, for me, this was a lifetime subscription. And so I emailed back to my editor. I said, you subscribe because you're poor and you'll remember to cancel. And so, unfortunately, lots of publications are structured this way, where it's easy to sign up and hard to get out. So there's plenty of sludge going around from the government. There are government websites that are only working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Well, I mean, is the computer on a union contract? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't think of any explanation for this. But yes, look, the thing is, Cass Sunstein, my co-author, and I did not invent nudging. It's always been around. Bernie Madoff was very good at nudging. He was not nudging for good. Eve, I claim, well, we men, were innocent until Eve came around with apples and things like that. So there's, nudging goes back as long as there have been humans. And it can be done for good or evil. So I worry about everybody that is using these strategies. And I mean, what we can do about it isn't clear. I'm trying to make people more aware of it, and that's the first step. So next time you start some service, look and see what you have to do to cancel and how hard it's going to be. I wrote a column about this in the New York Times, and they made me be like a real reporter. And so I called the Times of London and got them to explain why they had this. And the guy said, well, look, we want to be able to tell you about all of our great features. Like, do you know about our great sports section? Now, not being a big cricket follower, I wasn't that interested in that. Many airlines try to sell you trip insurance. So here's the most useful advice I have. Never buy trip insurance. So our hometown airline had a feature they've gotten rid of. I'm happy about this. They still are trying to hawk trip insurance. But it used to be, when I was writing this piece, that to buy a ticket, you had to tick yes or no to trip insurance. And yes was recommended. Now, I did a little investigation and said, well, let me attempt to buy a fully refundable ticket. Now, I don't need trip insurance for that, right? It's useless. If I don't go, I get my money back. So, look, do they still recommend it? Yes. And they charge more because the trip insurance is just proportional to the price. So yeah, there's a lot of sludge. There are, we're having an election soon. I think probably most of you have heard about that. There's an election coming up. We can make it easier or harder for people to vote. I think we should make it easier. I think democracy works better if more people vote. Obviously, politicians would like members of their party to vote, and so sludge gets introduced. And let me just repeat what I have on my book, Nudge for Good, and try to reduce the amount of sludge that you create.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up today's session. Nudge for good.